Well, lots to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Gloria La Riva is in San Francisco. She is the coordinator of the Cuba and Venezuela Solidarity Committee. From Miami, Rebecca Alarcon is venture manager for Project Pulso, a digital organization focused on linking Latin Americans in the United States. And with us in the studio, Mariano de Alba is associate director of the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's start in the studio with you, Mariano. Election's over. Nicolas Maduro gets another 6 years in office, but this comes, as I mentioned, amid accusations that the vote was rigged in favor of Mr. Maduro, that it was unfair, that he used rewards to get votes. What did you make of the election?
I mean, I think the election was a farce, right? The Venezuelan constitution and the Venezuelan law provides for certain conditions for elections, broad participation of political parties, the possibility of campaigning in equal terms, and so forth. And that's not what we saw over the last months in Venezuela. Not even mentioning the fact that according to Venezuela's constitution, the election should be held 3 months before the next term, and that is in January 2019, and this was held in May for one reason only, is that because of the country's collapsing, as Stephen was saying, and the government needed to hold this election before the collapse was even bigger. So I think in the end, Venezuelans didn't have a fair chance to decide who was going to be the next president. And because this is a violation of Venezuelan law and commitments that Venezuela has made under international law, I think that the conclusion is that this was no election.
Gloria, what do you make of what you've just heard, that this was not a fair election, that Venezuelans didn't get a chance to make their voice heard in the country?
Oh, I think it's ridiculous because the opposition has objected to every election that they have lost, which has been 22 out of 24 in the last 20 years. And the fact is that the U.S. called on the opposition to abstain in the vote, and that's why so many of the right-wing, the more conservative elements, those against the Bolivarian revolution, refused to vote. Here in San Francisco, maybe a handful voted out of some 2,000 people possible in the region. And that was a call from Washington. The other is that, referring to law and the Constitution, when the right wing had its say in the 2002 coup, they immediately, in their 48 hours of power, canceled the Constitution and abolished the Congress. So therefore, who really is for democratic rights? And I think yesterday's election was an astounding victory, actually. You cannot create a farce of such an overwhelming majority.
Liz, what did you make of the election?
Yeah, I think it's evident that by any measure by which you look at the numbers of the elections, whether it's the official numbers or the numbers that the international press is reporting, or even the opposition within the country, it's the lowest turnout that we've seen in decades. And so this election definitely shows the deterioration not only of the regime, but of the economic, political, and humanitarian conditions within the country. And I think that the categorization of these calls to the polls as a sham would be very accurate, given that the main opposition leaders within the country have been not able to participate in the process on Sunday. And so how could you categorize this as a fair, free election when the opposition was not given the opportunity to even compete in a fair way, which is why it wasn't the U.S., but the opposition that called for an abstention of an unfair process like yesterday. And so I think we're seeing more of the same and a heightened authoritarian hand by the Maduro regime right now.
Okay, let me bring...
That's ridiculous.
Gloria, I'll get to you in a moment. I want to bring in another one of our guests, another voice. I want to bring Lucas Koerner into the conversation. He joins us from Caracas. He's a journalist and political analyst for VenezuelaAnalysis.com. Lucas, welcome to the show. We just heard there that Venezuelans were not given a chance to express their political will. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that under conditions of international, sanctions and, basically an open call for all the major opposition parties to boycott this election, you still saw a result of 46%, which is better than presidential elections, in fact, in most countries. That Maduro received something like 30% of the vote, which is more than, in fact, Hillary Clinton received and what more than Donald Trump received, as well as more than Sebastián Piñera in Chile, Michelle Bachelet also in Chile, both Uribe and Santos in Colombia. So, I mean, to say that this is not a legitimate election on those grounds is, rather ridiculous. We visited electoral centers throughout Caracas, and we spoke with witnesses for the opposition parties. And it's important to note that in every electoral center, all parties have witnesses observing every step of the process, and they reported no irregularities at all. And I think that that's really important to stress amid these cries of fraud.
Mariano, what do you make of that? Because, yes, the number of people went up, maybe low, 46%. But as Lucas just pointed out there, this is not far different from elections in other countries. Does it put a question mark over the strength of the mandate that Maduro got?
I think it does. I mean, this is not an issue of unrecognizing that there's still an important part of the country who believes in Maduro, who believes in Chavismo. I think that this is an issue of if we're going to decide who is going to run the country, and throughout our history and through our laws, the rule is that the country is run by whoever the majority decides that the country should be run. Then let's have a fair and free contest to decide who is going to run the country. I mean, I'm not at all for an all for it solution in which Chavismo disappears. I think that Venezuelans, in fact, need to understand each other, need to have meaningful dialogue, and try to reconcile that the only path forward for the country, for the prosperity of the economy, is understanding each other and obviously resolving our difference in a democratic and peaceful manner.
Well, important you say that because, Mariano, because President Maduro has called for dialogue with the opposition, and he hasn't got the kind of response that he expected.
Yeah, but let's face the facts. This is not the first time that Maduro calls for dialogue, and we have at least two instances. The first one with the involvement of the Vatican, the second one with the involvement of the President of the Dominican Republic, which just recently he said that he didn't want to be involved in another dialogue, in which the government went to the table, it let time pass, and there was no meaningful result. So if the government really means to have a real dialogue, it has to show by action, by specific actions, that it has the will to reach a solution. Without that, it's impossible to have a dialogue nowadays in Venezuela.
Okay, Gloria, go ahead.
Yes, I think it's really interesting that President Maduro has continually called for dialogue with the same forces, opposition forces, whether they're corporate heads or a government or political officials who have been sabotaging the economy, and yet they're called to the table time and again. I think it's a great show of magnanimity from the government, but I also believe that the people want to see peace. That peace was achieved with the victory of the new Constituent Assembly last July, much to the chagrin of the U.S. government. And those people may claim that the U.S. in fact did not make the call for abstention, but today's act by President Trump of new severe economic sanctions against Venezuela that is designed to prevent Venezuela from finding an economic solution to the debt and for coming out of the economic crisis shows that they're trying to play again the policy of what undertook in Chile in 1973 with the coup and the fascism that prevailed afterwards. That's what the U.S. wants, and that's what the New York Times, for example, the U.S. media, is reflecting today in its editorial calling for the removal of Maduro. This is an absolute violation of the Venezuelan people's sovereignty and is no way going to be accepted by people around the world who recognize yesterday's victory of President Maduro.
Liz, do you accept that calling for the removal of Nicolas Maduro is a violation of the Venezuelan people's sovereignty?
I think it's not the right question to be asking, right? I think that regardless of whatever moves the U.S. takes, those are actions that the U.S. is entitled to do based on U.S. interests. But I think what we should be focusing on is on the actions of the regional community. There is no doubt, as was mentioned by Steve earlier here, that the refugee crisis is an emergency, that the humanitarian crisis is one as well. And so beyond whatever actions the U.S. decides to take or not, it's the Venezuela's neighbors that have a larger say as to how the crisis within the country is affecting the region at large. And it's the Venezuelan people at the end that are going to be able to decide how to move forward, which is why we're seeing the opposition, both the Democratic Unity as well as other factions of the opposition like the Libertarian Party, not only calling for new elections this year, whether it be on the 16th of July or elections later in the year with international observation. I think that talking about the U.S. within this context is just using the crisis within the country and attributing this scapegoat, alarmist, external influence as the focus and the reason why Venezuela is how it is. But I think we can all agree that within the country there is plenty to worry about, and people in Venezuela are the ones that are going to decide.
Lucas, there are challenges. Gloria, I will get to you in a moment. I just want to get to Lucas for a moment there. Lucas, it looks like Nicolas Maduro is going to face some major challenges right off in the aftermath of this election. For one, Gloria mentioned the fact that the United States has slapped financial sanctions on Venezuela. We have something like 14 countries that have recalled their regional countries that have recalled their ambassadors in protest against this vote. How serious is the challenge? How serious a challenge is that for Maduro and for Venezuela?
Yeah, I think it's really important to correct a few facts that have been said, because Alfred de Zayas, who is the UN's rapporteur for human rights, who came to Venezuela in November, has called U.S. sanctions against Venezuela a crime against humanity and called on the government to take the U.S. to the ICJ to prosecute these offenses. And it's clear that by restricting the ability of international financial institutions to lend to Venezuela has a real price for the Venezuelan people. And this includes, for example, the inability to import malaria drugs from Colombia that had to be imported from India, or all kinds of transactions for money in earmarked for food and medicine being frozen in the international financial system. So whether or not you agree with the government's policies or not, these sanctions are worsening the humanitarian crisis, and it's extremely cynical on the part of the United States government and pundits to be distracting attention from the real role that these sanctions are playing. And I think it's also important to note that with regard to these regional actors that you're referring to, that there's no consistency here, because what was happening last year during 4 months of violent anti-government protests, the opposition, the United States, and the so-called Lima Group was calling for early presidential elections. But once presidential elections were convened in February for April of this year, this entire group and the United States came out and said that these elections are illegitimate. And then Maduro moved the elections to May, from April 22nd to May 20th, in a bid to try to get the parties to participate. They still refused to participate. He invited Luis Almagro, who is a stalwart opponent of Venezuela, to come observe the elections, but he refused. So, I mean, if these aren't concessions, then I don't know what are.
Okay, Gloria, go ahead.
Yes, I think that the government of Venezuela, in creating 2 million houses given free to the people with a goal of 3 million by next year and 5 million total in the next few years, compared to a government like the U.S., which provides minimal housing and where millions are homeless in the United States, and where Trump and other government officials of the United States are talking about the mismanagement of Venezuela's oil. Their objection to Venezuela is that the oil is nationalized and used for the people, unlike the oil companies here, which are making hundreds of billions of dollars in profits, and poverty is skyrocketing in the United States. So again, we need to respect Venezuela's sovereignty, and the U.S. government should be condemned for this ongoing series of sanctions which are creating great hardship. And the media of the United States, which is saying that Maduro was buying votes with food. What the government is doing is trying to distribute food to millions of homes to overcome the hoarding of the corporations.
Okay. Mariano, we've just heard about the sanctions that have been imposed against Nicolas Maduro, against Venezuela, financial sanctions on the one hand, diplomatic sanctions as well. Let's listen to what Nicolas Maduro himself had to say about this. Let's watch.
De los Estados Unidos. The USA can't think they are the rulers of the world. Venezuela isn't governed by the government or the Constitution of the United States. Venezuela isn't a country that's invaded by them or by anyone. Venezuela is governed by a constitution, by national laws, and is governed by solid public institutions, solid public powers like the electoral authority. So, Venezuelans are governed by our own conscience.
So that's Nicolas Maduro's response to what's been happening. The U.S., as we've just heard, is taking a very hard line. But Nicolas Maduro has been getting the support of two other major powers, and that's Russia and China.
Yeah. I mean, first on that point, let me say that, you know, Venezuela, the government of Venezuela, and specifically the government of Hugo Chavez in the year 2001, undertook the international commitment to hold free and fair elections. Nobody put a gun on the government of Hugo Chavez to adopt that commitment. So if the government of Hugo Chavez freely decided to commit internationally to hold free and fair elections, then the logical conclusion is that the international community can request the government of Venezuela to hold free and fair elections. And then with regards to Russia and China, I think that's an important point to take. The fact that, you know, the government of Nicolás Maduro has made a disaster, a man-made disaster within the country is clear when you see that over the last year, for example, the government of China hasn't renewed any loans to the Venezuelan government. And that's one reason, because the government of China understands that any money given to the government of Nicolás Maduro doesn't go to the people. It simply is mismanaged, and there is no good investment in giving money to the government of Nicolás Maduro, because it is a corrupt country, and it is a country where a small group of people, a small group of elites are using the money for their own benefit. And
let me ask Lucas to respond very quickly to what you've just heard, Lucas.
Yeah, I just don't see where is the evidence that's being cited here. This past election is not free and fair. I mean, the opposition has presented no concrete evidence. In fact, Henry Falcon's economic advisor, Francisco Rodriguez,
Lucas, what about
Torino Capital,
what about the point that Mariano just made, that, you know, China has stopped granting loans to Venezuela, that the money is not going to the Venezuelan people, that it's going to an elite group of people?
No, I mean, clearly China, there's a deep economic crisis in the country, and China's not going to continue lending to Venezuela unless they take the kinds of economic reforms that they see necessary. And the economic reforms are necessary. But I think that it's really important to defend Venezuela's sovereign right to undertake those reforms according to its own rhythm, instead of imposing neoliberal IMF austerity logic, which the opposition wants to implement. I mean, we're talking about free and fair elections. What about Brazil and Honduras? I mean, these are clearly, you know, dictatorships that are backed by the United States, and no one talks about them. I mean, the reality is there is no evidence cited to suggest this election is not legitimate.
All right, looking ahead, Liz, what are the major challenges that Nicolás Maduro now faces? As we've just heard, the economy is in crisis. It's been contracting. You've got inflation, which is at, it's going to probably reach 5-digit levels at some stage, and the economy could dip into an even bigger, even deeper recession right now.
Absolutely. Venezuela counts with the highest inflation in the world, increasing economic crisis, humanitarian crisis, as we've been mentioning. And to add on to that, I think there is going to be a heightened restlessness within the country, given yesterday's results and the actions moving forward by the opposition. And there will be increased international pressure, whether that be, again, by the United States or regional actors, by the OAS, by the ICC, which it has been contemplated that they may begin to charge officials within the country for crimes against humanity. Again, the military, we haven't spoken about the military and their role in the crisis and in the political aftermath of Sunday, but I think that we will definitely see some major actions moving forward, given the results. So we have internal pressure, external pressure, international pressure, financial pressure, and a difficult year ahead, I think.
Gloria, what does the future look like? Because if we look at Venezuela right now, high unemployment, hyperinflation, food shortages, and the possibility that Venezuela could soon face oil sanctions. And this is a country.
First of all, Venezuela's aim to find economic solutions are being hampered this very day by the inability now of Citgo, which is Venezuela's property in the U.S. The Trump order says that it cannot use the Citgo properties to use as collateral for financing the debt. And in addition, we have to point out that oil prices collapsed in the last several years, and that's probably the principal reason for the shortages in income. More than 70% of the oil revenues is used for the people. And Liz talks about the regional community. The regional community is divided. There is Cuba and Nicaragua and other governments that the U.S. is trying to also attack. And speaking of human rights violations or crimes against humanity, there have been 400 journalists murdered in Latin America during the time of the Chavez victory up to now, the last 20 years, and not one of them has been killed in Venezuela, unlike Honduras of dozens, and in Mexico, where more than 100,000 people have died by the drug war and other violence. It has nothing to do with
Venezuela or the current state within the country.
It has to do.
One moment, Liz. I'll get to you in a moment.
Characterization. It has to do with your false characterization of Venezuelan society. And by the way, I've witnessed the elections in the past, and you have every candidate on television with equal time, unlike in the United States. So let's really talk about what real democracy is, and I don't see that in this country. Okay,
Liz, go ahead.
There are just so many points to unpack here. I can't
and I've just got 2 minutes left.
Can't contemplate those points knowing that the three main political opponents to the regime are not able to run in the elections. I don't see how that's even fair and free, and I'll stop there.
No, I think if I can jump in, I mean, in the end, this is not a political discussion, and Lucas is living in Venezuela and he knows this. This is a discussion of the well-being of the people. And right now, there's people suffering in Venezuela. There's people dying. There's people who cannot access food, who cannot access medicines. And the government had a fair chance. I remember in the year 2013, when a mission of UNASUR, a regional organization, made some economic policies recommendations to the government of Nicolás Maduro, and they didn't take it. So, I mean, the government has had its chance to deal with the issues that affect the people, beyond politics.
The government does have the right to reject advice from others.
Of course, it has the right, but we are now seeing the consequences of that.
Okay, Lucas, President Maduro talks of, he's promised the Venezuelan people an economic revolution. What does that mean?
No, I mean, I think this is the point, that Venezuelans need to resolve their economic problems, and that, sure, the government did not take the 2016 UNASUR recommendations, which I personally think that some of them are very important that it needs to implement, like reforming the really broken foreign exchange system. That's absolutely necessary. But nonetheless, just because the government has not implemented that, doesn't mean it has less of a mandate. I mean, it doesn't mean that they have sovereignty to solve their economic crisis. And the people I talk to here absolutely want change. They voted for change because they want to overcome this economic crisis, but they don't want to do it through privatizations and kind of neoliberal shock therapy that is being imposed in Brazil right now, where you actually do have a presidential candidate, Lula, who is going to probably win from his jail cell, where here you have Leopoldo Lopez, for example, who can't run because he was convicted of leading an insurrection against the country. So it's much more complicated than people outside the country say. But clearly what Chavistas here and opposition people are calling is for the Maduro to resolve the economic crisis. And that's through really building a productive base in the country to actually return to agriculture and, really try to develop the productive forces in the country. It's a very difficult, job in a country that has been dependent for over a century on oil production. So it's a tall task, but we'll see if the government is willing to implement the necessary moves in that direction.
Gloria, I have a few seconds left. Where is all this leading to?
I think where it's leading to is a need for the mobilization of the Venezuelan people in defense of their gains and to advance those gains, as Lucas has described. But clearly, you cannot have a free will to develop and overcome the problems without the end of the pressure and the sanctions and military threats by the U.S. government. That's key for us in the U.S., is to demand an end to U.S. aggression.
Okay, and that's where we are going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America, or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.